Birutė, you've been involved with orangutans for a very long time. You've become an icon for orangutans in Indonesia. How did you originally become involved in orangutans and research and conservation?
Well, I became involved with orangutans because there was something about them that spoke to me. So even when I was a youngster, I felt a connection with them through the power of their eyes, through their gaze. So I wanted to go and study them. And of course, the moment you start studying them, you realize that they're in grave danger of extinction as populations in the wild. So I started my conservation work almost at the same time that I started studying them in the wilds of Borneo.
So when you arrived in 1971, the first time you arrived here to commence your research, almost 4 decades, what was the state of the orangutan population then compared to now?
No comparison. Places that don't even exist now had forests that were full of wild orangutans. I mean, the devastation in the last 40 years has been overwhelming in terms of orangutan habitat.
I mean, a lot of the areas are now very fragmented and disconnected.
That's right. There are a lot of forest habitats. Many orangutan populations are totally fragmented with no connections to other forests. The amount of forest has decreased in terms of area. The number of wild orangutans has just plummeted. Wild orangutan populations have been reduced in size maybe as much as 80%.
So compared to the early days when orangutans were much more far-ranging, habitats were much more intact, what are the current figures for Bornean orangutans?
Well, we think, and these are estimates, I mean they're good estimates, but they're still estimates. We think there's anywhere from maybe 40 to 50,000 orangutans left on the island of Borneo. There are under 10,000 orangutans left in northern Sumatra. I think the latest figure is like 7,000 or less wild orangutans in Sumatra. So the orangutans in Sumatra are critically endangered. That's their classification. But the orangutans in Borneo are actually, despite their numbers, equally critically endangered because their populations are fragmented and small throughout Borneo. And most of those small populations are going to go extinct. So in Borneo, we basically have just several large populations, of which Tanjung Puting is one.
Tell us a little bit about your rehabilitation centre. You're one of the rehabilitation centres out of 2 or 3 in Kalimantan.
We are the oldest orangutan rehabilitation centre in Kalimantan, if not Indonesia. I have been working to rehabilitate orangutans, wild-born ex-captive orangutans since 1971. But one of the things that is very important when you rehabilitate orangutans to life in the wild is you need to save the forest. You need to protect the forest into which you are placing them. So our rehabilitation work has always had a very, very strong forest protection side to it, and we use the wild-born ex-captive rehabilitation program to save in Tanjung Puting National Park. In the early days, when a lot of officials would come through, and the importance of the park was emphasized by the fact that these officials would come and see orangutans close up, interact with them. In one case, the man who a year later became the governor of Kalimantan Tengah actually slept on the floor of our hut with orangutans next to him. Now that made an impression. I mean, that governor went back and he did everything in his power to protect orangutans. And he did everything in his power to protect Tanjung Puting National Park, which was then a reserve. So the wild-born ex-captives have been very powerful in helping save the forests of Tanjung Puting.
What would be your proudest moment and what you've been able to achieve?
I think one of the proudest moments is when the Minister of Forestry, 2 days before he resigned from the cabinet, established Lemandau Wildlife Reserve as a place where we could release wild-born ex-captive orangutans. And at the time, that was 76,000 hectares of forest that was slated to become palm oil that was saved. I mean, that's certainly one of my proudest moments. But mainly those moments have been with the orangutans. when you see them being successful as wild creatures, you know, having gone back to their birthright, which is the forest.
You've been involved in conservation in Indonesia for 40 years.
Yes.
Would you say it's getting easier or harder? What are the more recent challenges that you're finding?
It's getting easier and it's getting harder. It's getting easier because I think the level of awareness among the Indonesian people, especially Indonesian youth and students, has increased exponentially. I mean, when I talk to Indonesian students about conservation, sometimes they're much more sophisticated than me in their understanding of the issues. But on the other hand, it's gotten much worse. And the reason it's gotten much worse is because of the global economy. The economy in Indonesia has become globalized. So when I first went to Indonesia, to Kalimantan 40 years ago, you were dealing with local people who were dry rice farmers. And those people were relatively easy to deal with because you could talk to them, you could persuade them to go someplace else. And the Forestry Department did its job too. So for instance, the Forestry Department in Tanjung Puting National Park moved a whole village from the park across the river. You know, those were local issues, easy to deal with. But now you have palm oil plantations and timber estates. You're talking big money. You're not talking millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. You're talking billions of dollars. You look at the list of who are the wealthiest people in Indonesia. You know, it's like the only family that hasn't made its fortune in palm oil made its fortune in tobacco. So the globalization of the world's economy and the globalization of Indonesia's economy has made conservation much, much harder. While at the local level, when you're talking to local people, local government officials, and even government officials at the national level, they're much more aware, they're much more sophisticated in their understanding of conservation. But when you place that against the local economy, and you place that against corporations that can provide thousands of jobs to people, who's going to win? The corporation that can provide 1,000 jobs? Or the protected forest that has some orangutans and some protected birds in it? You know, I flew in a plane from Pangkalanbun to the northernmost part of the province. And I had a woman with me. You know, she came to see the extent of tropical rainforest destruction in the area. And by the time we left that private plane that had been chartered, she was weeping. Because between Pangkalanbun and those northern mountains, there wasn't one single piece of tropical rainforest left, except tiny little fragments that were totally degraded.
I've heard that and I've read in Sumatra, they've probably lost 75% of their rainforests in the last 20 to 30 years. What would you say the extent of forest losses in Kalimantan?
I would guess it's higher in Sumatra, but then, you know, I'm not an expert in Sumatra. Well, certainly 50%. In terms of total forest loss, it's 50%. But if you're talking about forest that's been badly degraded, forest that has been semi-destroyed by human contact and, you know, human activity, I would say 80%. I would say that less than 20% of the forests of central Indonesian Borneo are relatively intact. And one of those forests are the forests of Tanjung Puting.
How do you feel that conservation in Indonesia can improve, and how can it be achieved?
I think the key actually lies with the palm oil companies, that they have to get involved and really change their practices, but not only just change their practices, but also support in a big way conservation. I mean, some of them are doing it in a small way, but they need to step up and actually do it in a real way. Because without the support of the palm oil companies, the amount of funding that is available is minimal. I'm talking about the palm oil plantations that control hundreds of thousands of hectares and are making billions of dollars. They need to step up, they need to help, and they need to acknowledge that they are part of the problem.
There are quite a few new finance mechanisms coming into play in relation to forest conservation, such as REDD, REDD+. What kind of opportunities do you think that these offer areas for conservation?
I think these are wonderful, wonderful projects, triple REDD, but I think governments have to take advantage of them.
And what do you see the constraints being?
I see the constraints being is competition with palm oil, because palm oil is so lucrative. What the problem is the destruction of the forest, and the fact that orangutans are being crowded together. And what has surprised me is orangutans that were in the forest for years are now coming back. So what that indicates to me is that the habitat in the forest is not available to them as it used to be. And after 30 years, almost 30 years, one of the wild orangutan females that is a subject of my long-term study started coming to the feeding platform. So what's happening? Yeah. There's something happening out there.
Something's happening, dynamics are changing.
Something is happening, there are dynamics that are changing, and that is the real threat.